So the last thing in this chapter we need to talk about are the body cavities and the serous membranes. So there are two main body cavities. Body cavities is just where our organs are located. So there are two. There is the dorsal body cavity, and that's in the back. And I only show this one picture, but the other picture is in your book. So this is the dorsal body cavity. It consists of two things, okay? The cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. So it contains two things, the brain and the spinal cord, and that is it, okay? All other organs are going to be located in the ventral body cavity. Which is what I've shown here. So the ventral body cavity is cut in half. Okay, and it's divided by a structure called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is just a muscle. It's like a dome-shaped muscle under your ribs that allows you to breathe. Okay, so this top part is the thoracic cavity, and the bottom here is the abdominopelvic. So we've got the abdomen here and the pelvis. So the abdominal cavity is here, and then the pelvic cavity is here. Pelvic cavity. Okay? In the thoracic cavity, it is divided between the major organs in there. Okay? So you've got two lungs. So you've got two cavities that hold those two lungs, and they're separate. Okay? So those are the pleural cavities, and there's two of them. So pleural cavity here, pleural cavity here. Each of them contains a lung. This middle part here, this whole part in the center, is called the mediastinum. So this thing here is just called the superior mediastinum. Okay. One thing in there is like the thymus gland is in there. The trachea is coming out of there. Under it is where the heart is. Okay. So the heart has its own cavity, and it's called the pericardium. So the pericardial cavity. Okay. So there's a cavity for your heart. There's cavities for your lungs. Like a big cavity for most of your upper abdominal organs, and then a smaller cavity for your lower abdominal organs. So these cavities have membranes in them, okay? And they're called serous membranes. And they're there to cut down on the friction because you have this big lung in there. When you breathe in, it does inflate and get bigger. So if it were to rub against the cavity wall, that probably wouldn't feel too good if you could feel that. Same with your heart. Your heart pumps, and as it pumps harder or faster, you would feel that on the wall of that cavity, which wouldn't feel very good. So we have these things called serous membranes that protect us from that. And serous membranes are coverings of the cavity wall and coverings of the organ that are just sheets of cells, okay? And they're small cells. They're called squamous cells. So they're little small cells like this that come together, and they cover the organ and line the walls of the cavity. So there are two layers of the serous membranes, and they're two layers, but they are connected to one another. Okay, so it's kind of like a balloon. So if we have a balloon here, okay, and let's look at the heart. So here's my little heart. And if I take my heart and press it into this balloon, it's going to push this side of the balloon inward. Okay, so it's going to end up like that as it's being pushed. Okay, so ultimately what will happen is if I push this heart completely into that balloon, I'll end up with my heart, and around it will be the balloon. Okay, so that gives me two layers, an inner layer and an outer layer. The inner layer is called the visceral layer. The outer layer is called the parietal layer. Okay, and the two layers create a space. Okay, and inside of that space is fluid called serous fluid. And that fluid is what cuts down on the friction of those two layers rubbing together when the heart beats or when the lungs inflate and deflate. It keeps you from feeling that. Okay, so these layers have specific names. So in the pericardium, that visceral layer is called the visceral pericardium. And the outer layer is called the parietal pericardium. Okay, for the lungs, the visceral layer of the pleural cavity is called the visceral pleura. The outer layer is called the parietal pleura. Okay, so we have visceral pleura, parietal pleura, and it's the same thing. The visceral one is against the lung. The parietal one is against the cavity. In the abdomen, it's very similar. In the abdomen, we call the abdomen, as far as the serous membranes, the peritoneum. So we have a visceral peritoneum and a parietal peritoneum. And it's the same thing. You've got the visceral peritoneum covers the organs in the abdomen, like the stomach, the liver, the intestines, all of that. And then we have the parietal peritoneum that covers the wall of the abdominal cavity. Okay? These cavities, or these cavities here, these body cavities and these membranes are closed cavities. So these are closed cavities. And this means that these cavities are not open to the environment. Okay, when you open your mouth and swallow, nothing gets into your lung, nothing gets into your pericardium, okay? These membranes, serous membranes, cover cavities that are not open to the environment, okay? So that is the end of chapter 1. We end that with the serous membranes and body cavities. Please continue to review, and we will move on to chapter 2.